former mayor of Bowie, Maryland, not the current mayor. I haven't been the mayor for quite some time, but a lot of people do continue to call me mayor because once you achieve that local position in a local community, a lot of people continue to know because there aren't many of them walking around at any given time. We only have about three of them, as a matter of fact. It's much like presidents in other areas. But the position I'm occupying right now as president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation is one I'm quite happy about. And it's important to recognize that it's the Maryland Forestry Foundation and therefore not a member of the government itself, which means I'm not an administrator of the program I'm going to be talking about. We're one of the implementing organizations of this program. And frankly, I was very pleased to be able to be part as an advocate before the state legislature and with the last six governors. As a matter of fact, I'm very pleased to be one of the people who helped put this program together to help fight climate change and to be more environmentally sensitive and help preserve and protect and enhance the forest resources of the state of Maryland. Recently, I've been in touch with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and asked them to provide me with some of the PowerPoints they've used to explain the program to the public because the foundation, as an implementer of the program, is not usually talking about the program as a whole, but more specifically about our small role in it, which I'll talk to you about in the context of this presentation in the coming 30 or 40 minutes. We're going to be talking about this as soon as there we go. The program was established, the 5 million tree program, in 2021 as a part of House Bill 991. It was passed in the dead of night at the last hour of the legislature that year because the climate solutions bill had bogged down, and yet the only part of the then current climate solutions bill, which was passed the following year after a number of modifications, I might add, uh, was the part that everybody could agree on, the tree part. And that's because everybody saw trees as a universally beneficial resource and helping to not only sequester carbon, but reduce greenhouse gas. And so the 5 million tree goal between now and 2031 was in addition to the already adopted goals that the state had, which had been passed in 2019 in the Greenhouse Reduction Act. So basically, the state today in 2024 is committed not merely to 5 million trees, but frankly, closer to 10 million trees, which very few people, it turns out, are really that familiar with the ongoing commitment of these additional goals that the state has set over the last decade in various environmental programs. It's important to recognize that the 5 million tree goal has two broad pieces to it. One is the rural piece, where the larger part of the goal is to take place, actually about 450,000 of the trees for 4,500,000, let me say that correctly, of the trees are expected to be planted in the rural areas of Maryland. And about 500,000, or about 10% of this goal, is for urban in areas in underserved parts of the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. Uh, in order to accomplish that, to provide for the seedlings and the implementation, the state has set aside $15 million a year, of which $10 million of that goes to the urban commitment because of the higher cost of trees and resources in our urban areas, and 5 million goes to the planting of trees in the rural areas, even though it's a much larger goal. That 10% in urban areas, or 500,000 trees in underserved areas, is based upon census designated urban areas. So the state has provided online a tool that allows applicants for the funds themselves to look at where the target areas are by the legislation. And in the original legislation in 2021, there were several, well, actually, about four principal criteria set to decide where these underserved urban areas are. They were built upon a White House tool that had been under development for quite some time to help do it, but it was refined a little bit in Maryland to look at red line areas, former areas that banks had redlined for not qualifying for housing upgrades and loans, and hazardous areas based upon EPA criteria. They had to have above average unemployment. They had to have a median income, which was 75% below the state median income, which means basically they were in poverty areas of their respective urban communities, or they were a DHCD. That's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's the state agency. It's a program that, or project that had been funded by the state, meeting the specific criteria of DHCD funding. So they prioritize local organizations in those areas or that serve those areas or that are organized to help provide resources and services to those areas as potential future grantees of the 5 Million Trees program. So it's meant to engage individuals, although individuals themselves do not qualify directly for the funds themselves, except through an accessible group or business which is set up to implement the programs because of the ongoing requirements of its implementation. It turns out the Maryland Forestry Foundation is one of those implementing organizations. These areas, it's important to recognize, are scattered throughout the state. So the tool you will find online, and for any of you who are interested in following up today's conversation, I hope you'll look at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources or the Chesapeake Trust program. That's the trust that's funded by the Maryland Bay license plate, which administers between the agency itself and the trust. Those are the two organizations that administer the 5 Million Tree program. And both have on their website a interactive map that allows you to look very carefully at your respective community and where the underserved areas might be as identified by the criteria that are used in this particular program. And you'll note in this slide that there are a lot of various areas that are identified that focus in on these underserved areas throughout our state. And since they're urban areas, you're going to find these located in many communities throughout Maryland. There are 157 municipalities in Maryland, and nearly half of them qualify in small census districts for this particular program. So it's highly accessible at the local level to local groups that want to apply. There are some issues that we'll identify and some challenges that have been identified in helping to implement the program, but its broad application is not one of them. What counts when you want to apply for funds through a relevant organization is it can do site preparation, it can provide offsets for the cost of labor for planting trees, it can help you buy planting materials, that is, the trees themselves for planting. And obviously, that's going to vary a lot from the very small little seedlings we usually see in urban areas to the more potted trees that you're likely to see available from local nurseries. And by the way, it's important to recognize right off that no tree is eligible unless it's a local native species in this program. So, not just any bush, tree, or thing you might want to plant somewhere is uh, acceptable for this program. And then there's the requirement for maintaining the tree after planting because they don't just want you to put it in the ground and forget about it. They actually want a commitment out of the applicant organization and the recipient group to actually maintain the planting over time. And that time may vary a little bit, but for the rural landowner, it's 15 years. And that's subject to some inspections and it's subject to some verification over that period because we really don't want to see these resources simply wasted and lost, as have so many resources the state's invested in tree planting programs in the past. That's a whole nother subject for another conversation, perhaps. But the idea is that this time they're trying to make sure that the maintenance funds are available and there's follow up to the planting by providing the landowner with some incentives and, in some cases, in applicable projects, some signing bonuses, which I'll mention a little bit more of a little bit later. All of this work that is developed to implement the 5 million tree program is carried out by four major agencies of the state of Maryland. Well, I should say three agencies and a nonprofit 501c3 organization that has the bulk of the funds. Obviously, we're all familiar with the Maryland Department of the Environment. It is the coordinator of this program and tracks its implementation. And you'll notice in this tract it uses a little bit of government bureaucracy language like TMDL, that's total maximum daily loads, a fragment of the Chesapeake Bay program to reduce pollution in certain polluted streams around the state. And so the trees are really targeted in certain census districts along right waterways and that kind of thing. So it looks to identify where those trees would have the largest impact on reducing runoff and pollution in those areas. But that is an advantage in the applicant's program. It's not a requirement for every application. Second agency is DNR, which has, under this program, actually added some contractor positions through 2031, the length of time the program's currently funded. And the trust fund supports TREFA. That's the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust Fund, which implements this program at DNR. So it's a coordinated effort between the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust, which handles the granting aspect, and the Maryland Forest Service, which has the contractor positions to help the local organizations implement the specific projects that are funded in a given local area. The Chesapeake Bay Trust, CBT on this slide, administers the urban program. That's the $10 million for grants for trees for underserved areas. And their website contains an extensive amount of information and the time periods within which those grants have to be made on an ongoing basis. It's not constantly available, but it is frequently available on what's called a rolling basis throughout the year. And obviously, that's because it's not always appropriate to plant a tree every month of the year, at least in terms of its long term expected health. Now, frankly, a tree planted at any time is a good idea, but the bottom line is those planted in the spring and the fall are more likely to survive on a long term basis when you're doing large tree plantings than they are at the dead of winter or the height of the heat of summer. MDE, Maryland Department of Agriculture, is the third agency, state agency involved, and it administers what's called the CREP program. And the CREP program targets the 5 million tree program and applicant organizations through the other agencies on areas that are specifically address forest buffers along streams and provide an additional signing bonus through a CREP bonus program. A CREP is a federal program that the details of which are more available on the MDE website, and I'm not going to go into all CREP except to say it has its own bureaucratic burdens and signing necessary and paperwork in order to get those bonuses. But for large landowners or substantial, let's put it that way, substantial landowners along waterways in Maryland with the assistance of uh, an organization planting trees and buffers, anywhere from 25 to 50 to 100-foot wide bumpers, depending on what your local jurisdiction suggests or requires. These can be substantial because the bonuses represent an initial sign up of $1,000 an acre to the respective landowner. Now, obviously, there are some other options that are out there because the agencies involve technical assistance to a landowner to do this or to a local organization. They provide planning and coordination. Uh, they help you identify where the most opportune areas are to plant trees in a given census area, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. They You can even get some funds for removal of invasive vines and other plants in some cases where you're looking at particularly difficult areas in urban areas. And remember, all of it is focused on these underserved areas or waterway areas. There are a few other accessible things we'll talk about in a second because DNR has a critical role in all of this, in that providing technical assistance. So if you have an ongoing question, there are those 13 staff positions I mentioned earlier that have been created in order to provide assistance for both applicants and for implementation of the 5 million tree program. Now, we were very optimistic in our expectations for how quickly those positions would be filled back in 2021. The truth of it is, in 2024, now 3 years later, we're only now seeing that all of these positions are coming online. It's been a growing challenge with the both the state's pay scale for contractors and, frankly, the competition for jobs throughout the entire state to find the people to fill these jobs that have the skills that are needed to do so. The net effect is that in certain areas where you have high concentrations, for example, of underserved populations, such as in Baltimore City or in Prince George's County, those positions are uniquely staffed to provide technical assistance just in those areas, whereas other positions filled by the 5 million tree program provide broader cross sections of help throughout whole parts of the state in cooperation with the regional foresters. The other technical assistance is through uh, creating a larger seedling supply to help meet the needs of all the increased tree planting programs, and to look at how these new programs complement existing programs and do not duplicate the work that's already out there, because Maryland has more than a half a dozen major tree planting programs. Some are large, some are small. This is the largest, other than the greenhouse gas program for planting trees in Maryland. But there are some smaller ones which are very accessible to local governments and local communities. The fact is, they hardly require more than a couple page letter to get a couple of them. But in every case, they're designed to leverage the programs that exist and to coordinate with all the other work that's ongoing by these agencies to help address carbon sequestration, greenhouse reduction, and overall anything that has to do with tree planting. That technical assistance involves a nursery manager and those 12 tree planting specialists. And as I said, they're uh, statewide, and they have duties in outreach and planning maintenance. And right now, you can track the turnover in those positions because even at this early date in the program, the first 3 years, we've already seen some turnover in these positions as people were hired and immediately find there's a better opportunity once they become more familiar with what's going on in state government and they move on to another job, or sometimes they just get kind of picked up by another agency who says, gee, they would be really a better fit for our particular needs here. But the good news is we have an additional resource for the State Forest Service to address the needs of these ongoing tree planting programs. So they've been hiring to reflect the geographic and demographic diversity of the state to help implement this program through outreach, training, uh, and obviously it says they were projected to begin in 2022. It turns out again that was the goal back when the original program was fashioned. It's got a slower start because of the issues I've already outlined uh, in terms of recruitment, planning, and pay scale. Uh, Everybody would like to make more money than the state at that point was prepared to provide. And frankly, we've had a change of administrations during this period. You may recall we were ending the Hogan administration, we were starting up the Wes Moore administration, and Governor Moore has opened up state positions and freed up money for payment. And so there's been adjustment in the salary schedule as a result of that. And that has allowed recruitment to proceed more rapidly than it initially was under Mr. Hogan, who had a different notion about state employment and had a result of that. A lot of the positions were held back and not filled immediately in an effort to provide a different perspective on balanced budget issues at the time. The existing programs that are out there already are important because this program has one of, I mentioned several, so there is already a Marylanders Plant Tree program at local nurseries, and coupons are available in many sites around the state. So if you want to just buy a tree for your yard or plant it in your backyard, you can acquire one of these coupons, take it to your local nursery, and as long as it's a native tree, you can get 25 bucks off for any native tree you want to plant in your yard. And I happen to live in Bowie, Maryland. And as I pointed out earlier, I'm a former elected official, and a number of jurisdictions like ours supplement this process. Baltimore County, for a time, did the same thing, for example, and others are. So, in addition to the $25 that the state will provide in Bowie, we'll give you an additional $50 off. So you could get 75 bucks off of a tree that costs, for example, 150 bucks, and you got 50% off right away. Now that's important because a tree in the nursery that runs around $150 is a larger tree in a larger pot and much more likely to survive the initial stress of being planted and attended to on an intermittent basis. And a lot of people are not as attentive to these as they need to be. And they need a tree owner's manual. And by the way, such a thing does exist if you're interested in it. And access to a tree owner's manual is available on the Maryland Forestry Foundation website. There's another program called the Maryland Tree Mendist Program, and that's available to all local governments. It's a low cost. You can buy these containerized trees for public lands in your community. So if you want to plant trees around a school, or if you want to plant trees around public buildings of almost any type, libraries, police uh, stations, or fire stations, or anything of that kind of thing, the Maryland Tremendous Program has a uh, program of up to $1,500 to buy those kinds of trees. There's a gift for trees program. There's the lawn to woodland program. There's even a brand new program by the Maryland Department of Transportation that, because again, transportation creates the requirement for air quality mitigation. And so they've initiated, in addition to the tree planting that the agency itself carries out for major highway changes and improvements, for local governments and organizations to apply for grants of up to $5,000 through the Maryland Urban and Community Forestry Committee for that program. And there's roughly $100,000 a year set aside for local transportation air quality mitigation programs. That again is in addition to the 5 million tree program. And of course, there's backyard buffer programs that provides free seedlings for private landowners that are available. And obviously, we'll come back to the Maryland Urban and Community Forestry Grant Programs, which I was just mentioning. One of those is the Tremendous program, which is available through them, and the MDOT, Maryland Department of Transportation program, that's available through them as well. There are some other programs that are out there to supplement, and all of these are ways to implement. Now, I'm going to be talking about ways we implement the 5 million tree program a little bit and mix it up with a few other things, because the 5 million tree program is meant to integrate very successfully, as I mentioned, the Department of Agriculture with a federal conservation reserve enhancement program, which is targeted along waterways, that provides, in addition to 991, that's the 5 million tree program, a 1,000-acre bonus for new forest buffers. The foundation, the Maryland Forestry Foundation, in cooperation with the Maryland Forest Service and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, provides turnkey programs for private forest landowners. There are roughly 200,000 private forest landowners in the state. They own the bulk of all the forest resources in Maryland. About 70% of all of our forest resources in Maryland are privately owned. The agency itself actually only manages about 500,000 acres out of Maryland's over 6 million acres of land. And the Forestry Foundation is the state's largest nonprofit, other than the state itself, a tree planting organization. This year, under the Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters program, we will plant about 88,000 trees with the assistance of funds through the 5 million tree program. We will be working in at least a dozen counties throughout Maryland with probably, I have lost track, it's literally hundreds of landowners on hundreds of acres to plant trees under this program. Overall, the Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters program will account for about 20% of all of the trees planted under the 5 million tree program. That's about 1 out of every 5 trees will be planted through that program. Because recall in the very beginning slide that we talked about, the largest part of the 5 million tree program is targeted on rural areas. And the Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters program is targeted on those rural landowners that have open land where they want to expand their forest cover on that land. So for a rural landowner that has open space and wants to expand the forest cover on it, the Healthy Forest, Healthy Waters program is the ideal program, because it'll come in and plant the trees on your land. It will automatically take care for the first 3 years of your ownership of those trees, the maintenance of those trees. But you have to sign an agreement with us that you will maintain, protect, and continue to assure the health of those trees for the full 15 years from when the program began. In exchange for that commitment, we plant and take care of the programs, but we will, through that program, then allow you to uh, apply for and get the lowest property tax rate available in that jurisdiction for the land covered by the tree planting on your property. That's forest conservation management plan, a forest health plan on your land. And frankly, we're looking at options on how even those incentives for the expansion, protection, and maintenance of our forest cover on lands can be strengthened in the years ahead. And by that, I mean everybody knows that when you plant trees, obviously, we talked about carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas reduction as some of the primary goals in this program. But frankly, everybody knows that when you plant a tree, you get a variety of other benefits, such as improved water quality, hence the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program and the bonus there. Or you get cleaner air, or you get better access to wildlife on your property, even in an urban area. You see more birds. It's a food source. You see more small critters running around your yard, all of which makes nature itself more accessible, particularly when you've insisted on the use of native species, which provides the habitat for our local critters. The net effect is we'd like to see landowners who invest in these kinds of commitments over a long period of time to find even additional financial incentives in the future for the ecological service benefits that their property is now providing to the public as a result of the work on their private property. The net effect is we're going to be talking with policy leaders in the legislature in the coming year about these additional incentives, all of which would be made available through what is called the Woodland Incentive Program you see on this side, which is a kind of a cost share program that includes tree planting. It's administered by the Forest Service, but it's designed to provide financial incentives and technical assistance to all of Maryland's forest landowners, particularly those who are committed to the preservation and protection of their of tree resources on their property in the years ahead. Federal programs are mentioned here. There's several of them. I'm not going to go into the details, but the bottom line is the overall program is designed to enhance and expand forest cover on the land. Now you might say, "Oh my gosh, we got enough woods already. What do we need more already?" Well, the truth is we're losing forest cover on a regular basis, and we have been for the last 50 years or more. We've certainly reduced the loss of forest cover on our lands through a variety of policy changes over the last 50 years. The Forest Conservation Act being the most significant one because it directly affects the development process. And development itself is the biggest single threat to forest cover in Maryland. We lose more trees in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, Baltimore County through the development of lands and the cutting of trees through a terminal harvest than any other thing that goes on. And we've added to that significant new forest threats in the last two generations, more than 400 of them that are out there now we didn't have a couple generations ago. And by a couple generations, I mean about 40 years. But the 5 million tree program is a kind of an umbrella program that we work then to kind of fill all of these ungapped needs, these gaps that are out there. Funds are subject to restrictions. They're not intended for harvesting for timber, for example. They're on private lands, requires a legal agreement, as I mentioned. but frankly, it's easy to plant trees. Uh, there are a number of programs designed to assist you, and I hope you'll find through the websites that I've mentioned and the organization that I represent new ways to focus on conservation and equity priorities in your particular community, because all of these options are really meant to help us deal with the ongoing effects of events like we've just been witnessing this week in Florida. From planning to growing, we require maintenance strategies that expand the opportunities for volunteers. And so there's new ways that individuals can get involved through a tree stewards program or urban and community forestry training program or the conservation reserve enhancement or riparian rangers or green gorillas or half a dozen other things that pass for ways to get local volunteers, local organizations, local schools and nonprofits involved in local tree planting organizations. And there's local tree care groups throughout the area that support these agreements. We encourage them all the time. And they're all linked to workforce development of the future. And you may recall in the introduction that the foundation supports a natural resources careers camp, an urban forestry careers camp at the University of Maryland, and fellowships in natural resources careers and urban community forestry in the Maryland system of higher education. So we have programs for involving kids in the future of forestry throughout the state, and Maryland is one of the most progressive states in the nation in implementing these types of opportunities for young people in the nation. But there are some challenges. There are some challenges. I don't want to overlook them. Certainly, I've mentioned a couple: the ramp up time needed to increase tree supplies, the fact that there aren't a lot of trees out there available to plant at any given time. We've had to get nurseries growing more trees to help meet these organizations. We've needed to build new staffing patterns and the agencies themselves to do it. We've had to hire new people, partner with new organizations. And of course, the real issue is where's the land coming from to plant all these new trees? And so we've had some studies ongoing about where they can be put. So it does excludes prime forest land. It excludes bird areas and other specific grassland habitats. But there's not every place is suitable for trees, too close to structures, airports, or other kinds of obviously roads and highways and those kinds of things, but we've identified that there is ample land available in Maryland to meet the 5 million tree goal or even the 10 million tree goal, because the scale of that, if you see on this slide, is about 20,000 acres. The real limiting factor is not that there's not land out there when we look at it from above. It is whether or not the people who own the land, because the majority of that land, over 90% of it, is in private hands. And so landowner interest is the critical variable in whether or not we'll actually be able to address these things. And so outreach becomes the critical need. And that's why I'm particularly pleased to be able to present this webinar with you, because you can assist all of us in helping to look at this. Where would the next tree be planted? Who might be interested in having it? How can we make sure that it's linked to local health and wellness and cooling and water quality goals? Because all of these things are simply a part of the larger thing that we call the ecological system. Now we know that the trees available are spread across the state. Here in our area in central Maryland, in the Baltimore Washington corridor, uh, the larger blue part is the private lands. Remember, I said about 90+% of it is on private lands. There are some additional public spaces available in the central part, but that's less so throughout the state. And the foundation tends to focus on the eastern, southern, and western parts. we're looking to other organizations to focus on the urban core of this. Help us identify these areas. Follow up with this thing because there's a lot of partners out there. I mentioned the Chesapeake Bay Trust, the ones that do the Bay license plate. You'll see our logo up there, or American Forests, or the Baltimore Tree Trust. There's more than a half a dozen organizations in the Baltimore area, or the Greater Baltimore Wilderness, or the Alliance, which is throughout the entire Chesapeake watershed, or the Baltimore Tree Trust. I'm confident that those of you in the audience know at least a half a dozen organizations that could apply and implement grants in this particular area. There's lots of options. I welcome the opportunity to work with any of you who would like to reach out to the foundation, MarylandForestryFoundation.org. And I look forward to talking with you, to working with you, and hoping to see you a successful planter of trees in the year ahead. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you have, and we'll quit sharing this screen and I'll come back and see where we're at with questions. I hope that kind of brings us up to date.
Thank you, Gary. That was very informative. Let me put a spotlight on you for everybody. And we have in spotlight. We have a couple of questions already in the chat box for you. One is from Amanda. Where are the staff positions? I think you may have, Amanda, did Gary answer that question, or you might want
Well, I
to
didn't
follow up?
specifically say where they were, but there are applications available. I think currently there are one or two of them still unfilled. The majority of the positions are with well, they're all with the Maryland Forest Service. The majority of the positions were in uh, Annapolis. But now, as we've looked and seen the program mature, we're now looking at those positions being identified and placed across the state. So you're going to find that the agencies involved, and that is the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, has begun to look at distributing those 13 positions in various geographic areas around the state. As I mentioned, one of them specifically is in Prince George's County, another one in Baltimore City, some are in Annapolis, but others will be located in both the Eastern Shore and Western Shore, and then additional ones right in the central part of the state. So you're going to find that there's options around the state for the 13 positions, and there's at least, last I heard, two of them that remain unfilled.
Okay. And then Grace has asked, have you partnered with schools or school systems in the past?
The answer is we are partnering with schools. The foundation is not the lead organization in working with schools. That's the organization that's working with them is called a MAO. That's the Maryland Outdoor and Environmental Association or Organization. MAEO. I can't remember the name, but you apologize me, and I should know. Look on the line for MAO, MAEO. It's a organization of environmental educators, and they're working directly with schools. There is another group out there that is also working with schools to assist them, and that's called the Maryland Forestry Board Association. And the Maryland Forestry Boards are affiliated with the foundation, but in each county of Maryland, there is a local forestry board, and their responsibility is in part outreach to the local schools. So between Mayo as an implementing organization for teachers and administrators and the forestry boards, which directly work with the business community and landowners in those areas, I think you'll find a ready partner for implementing local tree planting projects in your particular area.
Okay, we have a couple more.
Sure.
Dave asked, what is the primary objective of planting trees? Is it oxygen, erosion, animal habitat, and how will you measure the benefits of planting these trees?
Well, a tree is like a diamond ring, friends. In my opinion, a good diamond has a lot of facets to it, and it really is whatever facet engages your attention. the neat thing is if plant a tree for water quality, you get not only water quality, you get air quality and habitat benefits. In addition to that, the tree provides all those other benefits in addition to the one that you really wanted out of it, free of charge. And so, why do you plant it? Well, it depends on what the particular objective is of that particular program to support the tree planting itself. In this case, the 5 million tree program was a part of the climate solutions bill, as I mentioned earlier in thing. And so the focus was on carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas reduction. But if a tree is planted for any of those purposes, you get all the other purposes, other benefits, which is why other organizations try to coordinate with this program in advancement of their particular goals as well. So I would say a tree is a multi benefit kind of nature's multi benefit insurance plan for the future of all of us.
Ed, thank you. Maureen is asking about data centers. There's a lot of data centers going in and some power lines, I'm assuming. And do you have, are there any conflicts of if there's trees that have been planted and new initiatives coming in that will take those trees out?
Well, that's a particularly complicated and controversial topic, and the foundation presents its own set of webinars every third Thursday at 1 o'clock. And this month's webinar is on data centers coming up just next week on Thursday at 1 o'clock, and you can sign up and register on our website. A data center, you have to remember about data centers is that everybody when you're working on your computer, you're constantly reminded about the use of the cloud. Well, the cloud really isn't up in the air, it's on the ground. And it's housed in a series of resources that are expanding because our use of technological innovations involving computers and AI is expanding rapidly. The net effect of that, particularly in the Washington metropolitan area, is the substantial expansion of sites to house these kinds of installations. What some of you may not be familiar with is that these installations are growing more rapidly than anybody ever anticipated. And while they offer significant stimulation for local jobs, they also offer significant impact on the landscape. And the landscape they're taking frequently is areas, obviously, where people don't live. So they're looking at current forest cover to be cleared and made as places available for the installation and maintenance of these centers. But they also have to be supplied continuously with power because they don't want them to go down, just like we've been witnessing the millions of people that lost power in Florida. We want to keep our data centers up, and everybody considers access to the internet as kind of as important as access to electricity and cell phones. Well, all of these installations, marvelous installations, useful installations, a critical part of modern life, have an impact on forest cover on the land. And the net effect is that some of the newest ones, data centers being example, are exempt from the traditional land management tools in our state, based on actions by the legislature, which I consider to be not as, what can I say, as visionary as they should have been. They were all engaged in the short-term economic impact and not the long-term environmental impact of these things. And now we're beginning to appreciate that what we're losing is maybe be as important as what we're gaining in some respects. And we began to rebalance this equation in ways that we hadn't done in the short term. That's the controversy about it, how to rebalance that equation. So, for example, I'll give you, and I'll close. There is a proposal to develop and this is simply to feed a new data center in the Frederick and Northern Virginia area, a corridor for a power line that is about 150 feet wide and 70 miles long, that runs across almost every environmental easement and land clearance management tool we've already have in place just in northern Maryland right now. the Piedmont Project. You'll see it in the newspapers if you haven't already. And I'll simply say that's an example of how this rebalancing has got to occur in the future. And you're going to hear a lot more about that in the years ahead, particularly over the next couple of years, as these projects become much more visible to the public and the benefits are questioned in new ways that weren't originally a part of the equation that led to their agreement to construct them in advance.
Well, I think that you're going to have a lot of people at your webinar on data centers. That's such a hot topic.
It is.
Do we have any other questions for Gary? I have one. While people are thinking, you can also raise your hand, and you can unmute if you want to ask a question directly to Gary. I mean, we've maybe, I'm just assuming that we've all planted a tree before, or planted 2 or 3 or plants, and some of them, or a lot of them, don't live. I mean, planting the tree is one thing, but having it grow and thrive to some kind of maturity where we're deriving those benefits. So what is the built-in, I guess, mortality rate or the non-survival rate of all of these programs? Are they built into that?
The answer is yes, we have. And I'll simply, in fact, is this a good way for me to close, if you don't mind? Um, planting a tree is the cheapest, easiest, most long lasting commitment anybody committed to the environment can make. 6 governors have asked me questions like yours, and I've always said it's the easiest thing that a local landowner, a local citizen can do if they want to contribute to the health of the environment in the long run. But the truth is, trees are like everything else that are a part of our life. They have a lifespan. They don't last forever. In an urban area in Baltimore, for example, the average lifespan of a tree, believe it or not, is less than 20 years. In Washington, it's less than 15 years. Okay. That's why you have organizations like Casey Trees, which are constantly replacing, just as a private organization, about 8,000 trees a year on the private landscape in Washington, D.C., in addition to their local Urban and Community Forestry Committee in Washington. Here in Maryland, the Forest Service is planting literally over 100,000 trees a year simply to make up. The Maryland Department of Transportation is planting over 100,000 trees a year to supplement those lost along our rights of way of highways and that kind of stuff. Point is, trees don't live forever. They seem to live longer than we do, and for well maintained, almost every native species that's out there in the landscape will live longer than you. But the truth is, we don't always take good care of our trees. We run over them, we neglect them, and because of what's been changing in our economy and our world over the last 50 years or so, new threats have become involved. So we have things like the emerald ash borer, which didn't exist a dozen years ago, or insects that no one had ever heard of even 5 years ago, or other kinds of threats. There are over 400 of these that have been identified and emerged over the last 50 years in the United States alone. My bottom line is, it doesn't mean you shouldn't plant a tree. It doesn't mean you won't enjoy the benefits of a tree. It simply means you're going to have to pay constant attention to the legacy that that tree represents if you want to see your grandchildren see its health and to provide. So the wise man plants a tree under whose shade he'll never set. And I hope all of you will be a part of that kind of commitment in the years ahead. Thank you very much for having me and the Natural Hill Society. It's been a pleasure to talk with you this evening, and I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. And I think that we all need to go out and plant not 1, but 2 or 3. Just keep planting trees. Like you said, it's easy and it's so effective. Everyone stay well, stay curious, stay outside, and go plant a tree. Thank you, Gary.
Amen.
Good night, everybody.